Hey church, Pastor Brian here. Today's devotional thought is from Luke chapter 5 verses 1 through 11. That's the passage where Jesus, goes to the shore and he sees Peter and James and John. They're cleaning up their nets because they had a terrible day fishing. They didn't catch anything. And then Jesus has them go out, and he teaches the crowd from their boat, if you remember that story. And then when all of that's over, he goes to them and he says, hey, I want you to throw your nets on the other side of the boat there. If you remember that part, right? They pull in the catch, and it's such a big catch that it takes all three of them, I think, to pull the thing in, and they just marvel at who Jesus is and his ability to do all that, right? And so then it says at the end of that story in verse 11, it says that's when they followed him. That's when they said, we're going to follow this guy. Now, what I want to make sure that you understand when it comes to this passage is what happens at the very beginning of it in verse 1. Verse 1 says that the crowd was pressing in on Jesus because he was preaching to them the word of God. Think about what Jesus would have been preaching to them. He hadn't died yet. He hadn't gone to the cross yet. And so when he was preaching the word of God to them, he was helping them understand the heart of God. Essentially, that's what Jesus was always preaching. He was clearing up the misunderstanding that I think was brought on because of the Pharisees and because of their teaching. And he was telling them what God's heart is all about. But what's interesting to me is that passage, if you look at the context for what Jesus does is right there in the first verse. The reason that Jesus goes out and preaches from the boats isn't just so that he would have a better platform from which to preach. The reason he did it is because he recognized that he needed disciples who would follow him, who would also preach the word of God, right? In other words, the crowd pressing in on Jesus was the reason that Jesus called his disciples. Now again, if you look at the text, what you see that he does there is he speaks to them in a language that they understand. He talks about fishing for men instead of just for fish. But the whole point was Jesus was calling his followers to get on mission with him. And so what I want to encourage you to do today, if you're a follower of Jesus, especially with Easter coming up, is to take serious his commandment to call people to preach the word of God, to help people understand what God is really like. I think our culture has no idea what God is like, in part because of how some Christians act. Let's be followers of Jesus, especially this Easter time. Let's be followers of Jesus who invite people to meet the God of the Bible, the real God of the Bible. This is why Jesus called his disciples to fish for men. I hope you would answer that call this Easter.